And good evening. Welcome to our first meeting of the year 2025. And I found out that the year that 2025 is quite a special number, although I think you probably could find something special about all the years, but 2025 is the perfect cube of 45, the square of 45. I think that's what it is. And also, there's many other features. That's like, I think it was also the square or the cube. I think it was a cube of all the numbers 1 through 9 squared. Something like that. These, like mathematicians, people who like numbers. And you can like numbers. There's something to love about numbers. Can find all sorts of things. But anyway, we pray that 2025 will be a special year, somehow or other. Remember saying that about year 2020, and it went south terribly with COVID. So I hope my prayer today is it doesn't have the same effect, but that there will be some real blessings in this year. So we're looking at Mark's Gospel, and we're into the third study of the Gospel. So we're looking for the whole of the first chapter and then the beginning of the second chapter. And we will read it very shortly. And we will read again the first episode of Jesus's kind of transcendent power that we read before, which was his delivery of this man from an unclean spirit in the synagogue. And we discussed what the meaning of the unclean spirit was. It was a kind of a fracturing and a splitting apart of the self becoming other than the self, even though it still is the self, and the self is not whole or wholesome. And this comes up repeatedly, the feature of the unclean spirit, or what is then called demons, comes up repeatedly in this first chapter, more than anything else. And so you wonder, and it's a question to ask, if the writer, so this is Mark, whoever Mark was, but Mark, the writer, he's beginning the gospel. He's the first gospel to be written. And, he has to start somewhere. And he starts very markedly, very, very significantly with the power of Jesus to bring healing to people suffering from demons or unclean spirits. I take those two things to be the same. But unclean spirit might, I think, be more of a Hebrew, a Jewish name, and demon a more of a Greek cultural and kind of the larger Gentile world kind of name, that there were many different spirits and demons inhabiting different places. And with the Jewish experience of the larger world, beginning with the captivity in Babylon, there would have been a much more increased sense of the alternative spiritualities or the alternative spirits in the world that were possible. And but you don't, as I've mentioned before, you don't hear mention of that hardly at all in the canonical scriptures. They're probably in the intertestamental scriptures and the apocrypha, that there are mentions of demons there. But it's something very typical of the New Testament and something very typical of Mark. So you have to wonder, you have to ask yourself, well, what is it that is so pressing about the demonic or the unclean spirit that Mark basically starts with that? So the other Gospels, if you take Matthew and Luke, for example, they start with these kind of very kind of gripping stories of Jesus's birth. They begin with these narratives that pull you in, and they're exciting in their own way, because Jesus, with his parents, it comes out of it well, even though there are threats and dangers, especially in Matthew. So you're with the other Gospels, you begin with a more of a standard background of the heroic figure, of the remarkable figure that you would get in other biographies in the ancient world that would begin with a narrative of infancy. But there's no easy way in like that at all in Mark. You go straight in, and Jesus immediately confronts the demonic. So you have to ask, what is it that the gospel writer Mark is representing by that, and what are the conditions in which he's writing that make that so a kind of compelling way to begin for him. And you then have to also ask, why is it in Jesus's own life that the gospel is reflecting that at least according to Mark, has such a prominent role, Jesus' power over the demonic. And I mean, I think that it's one of the reasons why I chose Mark's gospel to go through again is because I think we live in something of a similar world to Mark and the early Christians, and indeed to the Judeans to whom Jesus ministered. Because if you take the demonic not as some kind of mythological entity, a real spirit from another realm, and of course you'd have to explain what that realm is and where they come from and how they got there. But if you do not see it in mythological terms like that, because there's nothing in the Bible to explain them in that sense, unless you read into texts certain possibilities, or in, I think in the one text in the New Testament, which is Jude, the letter of Jude, there is a mention of there is an evocation of the book of Enoch, which has elements of the spirit world apart from this, but it's very, very vague, and it's certainly not mainline. And for example, Paul never bothers to explain the demonic in any kind of way. He just takes it as in some way as read as in regards to the food offered to idols, and idols would be demonic in his estimation, kind of like, or he would also say that they don't exist, and therefore you don't have to worry about them. You know, Paul is that much kind of deconstructed in his understanding of the spirit world. I mean, like Christ has completely triumphed for him. So this language of Mark is very particular to Mark, and I think it's representative of this fracturing of the spiritual world that happens when violence has entered a phase of crisis and breakdown, whereby the structuring role of violence in its in the ways in which, you know, Gerard teaches that it can be structured and is actually self-structuring in that very perverse way in which it works. It creates the order of kingship and sacrifice and exclusion and boundaries, all that kind of thing, you know, and that's an effective way of controlling violence. But when that starts breaking down, then humanity enters into what Girard calls a mimetic crisis or a sacrificial crisis. And I think in Judea at the time of Jesus, there was an acute sacrificial crisis. And the fracturing of identity and the persona or the personhood of people is evidence of that. So Jesus goes into a world, the Markan world anyway, which is very much in an experience of breakdown and fragmentation about in terms of people's identity and their sense of safety, their sense of wholeness in regard to kind of like the abyss of violence, which the world can fall into, and which indeed in the case of Judea, they were going to fall into. 40 years, 45 years after, 35 years after Jesus' death. And it wasn't too long. I mean, it was a horrendous Jewish-Roman war, which killed half the population. It was a tremendous pit of violence they fell into. And it's like it's building up. These things take time to build up. So Jesus walks into a kind of like an amphitheater filled with violence, a kind of human theater of existence in the Markan understanding. And he has this immediate power over it. So that for me says something about the situation in Rome, that Christians in Rome would have felt themselves surrounded by the demonic, both in terms of that kind of standard reference of idolatry, but also the intense violence of the Roman world, the games and the slaughter of the games, the gladiatorial games, and the permanent war, really, of the Roman Empire. That would have been an existential experience for them. And so Jesus, emerging immediately in the Gospel of Mark as someone who has power over the demonic, over this fracturing of the human spirit, in which the human spirit can turn against itself, is the gospel for Mark. I think you know that really has to be highlighted, and that's why it's in some ways so important for us today, because we live in a somewhat similar world. To go into more detail about this, the Romans, as you know, were in physically present and in charge of Jerusalem. There was a Roman prefect, and in that time of Jesus, it was Pilate, who was the commander, the ruler of Jerusalem. It wasn't Herod or the high priests. It was a Roman officer, a Roman delegate from Rome. Now, this all derived, that possibility of a Roman being in charge of the holy city, which really hadn't happened since the brief reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, when he invaded and took over Jerusalem in the 2nd century before Christ. So you've got the Romans having taken over in Jerusalem from 63 BCE. Is when Pompey the Great, who was eventually defeated by Caesar, I think it was Julius Caesar, if I'm not mistaken, he conquered Jerusalem. His armies took Jerusalem. And from that point onwards, Judea was a client state of Rome under Herod the Great, who ruled from something like 35 or something BCE. He ruled for a long time. Maybe before that. I think he ruled all for 35 years. And he died 4 BCE, so he ruled from about 39 BCE. And so Herod had a successful reign, but he was under the Romans. And when Herod the Great died, there was a period, there was a kind of interlude of some chaos where the Romans didn't really have someone that I'm not an expert in that period, but I don't think they had anybody they could rely on quite like Herod the Great. And they took over direct rule in 6 CE. So Herod the Great dies in 4 BCE, and kind of 10 years later, Rome takes over direct rule. Now you have to think of what that means. Pompey, when he conquered Jerusalem, went into the Holy of Holies, something nobody was supposed to do except the high priest. He walked in there because he was the conqueror. He just walked in. He says, "What's in here?" And he was surprised to find out there was nothing in there. The room was empty. Because the Ark of the Covenant had gone, and it was just an empty room. It was where God dwelled. And only the high priest could go into that space, which was like the universe. Apparently, it was a kind of copy of the universe, where you could encounter God directly. But he'd gone in there, and he defiled it. Now I don't know. They didn't have another Hanukkah, which came after Antiochus Epiphanes. They had a dedication or a rededication of the temple. I don't think they rededicated it because the Romans were then in charge, and it would have been an insult to them or something like that. So the Holy of Holies had been defiled, and the sense of that of the holy place of the temple would have lost some of its purity and some of its religious power. In other words, to focus and kind of magnetize the people in the right direction, in the direction of God. That center and that focus would have been lost. And the fact that from 6 CE there was a Roman prefect right there in his headquarters with a Roman garrison, and I don't know how many men, maybe about 1,000 or something. But the fact is, they were there. They could walk around. They could do as they pleased. They could force people to carry things for them. They could rape and steal if they wanted to, if they weren't kept in order by their superior officers, all that kind of stuff. There was this presence in the land which really had never been experienced before, except in that brief period under Antiochus Epiphanes. It was 2.5 years, or 3.5 years. That the Maccabean Wars lasted until they expelled the troops and the representatives of Antiochus. So, but now they have this prolonged period of Roman rule and Roman presence. So what I think is that you have to, and it's hard for us, we just think, well, they're demons, okay? And Jesus is God, so he has power over these other worldly spiritual beings, which of course, there's truth in that. But if you look at it historically and sociologically, it's much, much more powerful that the Jewish sense of their holiness and their holy place had been defiled and was continually defiled. They were continually decentered from who and what they thought they were. And the great evidence for this is the Pharisees. The Pharisees who found themselves a way of protecting themselves against that decentering and that defilement by hyper purity and by expanded and multiplied rules of purity. They were able to build a barrier against that. And they had, in fact, they didn't really rely on the temple anymore. They relied on themselves and their world of internal integrity of purity. And that, in a way, that hasn't changed since. I mean, in some ways, that is the nature of sincere, dedicated Judaism to this day. The temple had already failed or begun to fail very seriously because of the presence of the Romans in the way that they were physically present and able to walk into the temple anytime they wanted to. And the Essenes are another example. The Essenes withdrew totally, physically, from contact with Jerusalem. And that's another manifestation that there was something very destabilizing and destabilized about Jerusalem. So if you take those are indications of the kind of spiritual crisis that Judea and Judaism was in at that time. When Jesus comes into that setting and begins by restoring, or really actually offering a new form of identity and stability and focus in relationship to himself, not the temple, and not purity laws, and not the kind of hidden away camp of the Essenes, right? Just by relationship to himself, you could begin to see the power of what he was doing. He offered a completely new basis for being a dedicated member of the covenant community, covenanted to the God of Israel and to the law of Israel. He offered a completely new basis of relationship for that to be possible. And so if you're not a Pharisee, and if you're not an Essene or temple priest who still somehow believes in the temple, even though it has been defiled, it's very possible that you're going to experience, as a Jew, a Jewish person, you're going to experience some destabilization and some fracturing of your selfhood. I mean, you've got to think about the experience of the Jews. You've got to think of their whole 1,000 years experience. Think of the exile, the return, the rest of the restoration of the temple. And then the Romans come in and do what they do with impunity. Fragile people and people who are dispossessed in any kind of way, who are more vulnerable for all the kind of various social reasons that people can be vulnerable, they would manifest a fracturing of the self. And I think Mary Magdalene is a good example of this, because according to Luke, Jesus cast out of her 7 demons, and that's normally personalized, like there's something, like she's a prostitute or something. No, she's someone who actually suffered intensely from the fracturing and destabilization of the spiritual world she was in. And I would see her as an example of how somebody of some kind of spiritual sensitivity or sensibility, who is not a Pharisee, she's a woman, could have been deranged by that world. And the moment that she enters into a relationship with Jesus, that goes. She finds a new focus for her selfhood that is completely related to him, because that's what he offered. That's what he offers. Have faith in me. That is, have a relationship of total trust in me, and the Father, I will show you the Father, or the Father will be with you. So he kind of radicalizes and revolutionizes the core relationship, spiritual relationship of spirituality that the Jews had been used to because of the temple and because of their law. All that kind of stuff was in crisis, in a sacrificial crisis, and Jesus offered immediately a solution to that through his own persona. I mean, it's a revolutionary, because it's not external. It's not like the temple or the rules of the law or a sacred or a safe space, a safe holy space like the Qumran Essenes. It's in a direct relationship with this person. It's never happened before. You may have had philosophers who had disciples, but that's an intellectual thing. They were taught a way to think, but there was something about Jesus that was directly relational, and it brought them in to this new and eminently safe space of spirituality. And that's what I think we're reading when we begin to read Mark's gospel. That's what's happening. And we're going to read it now so we can see that. But just before, I want us to think about the parallels or the possible parallels in our own time. We're not living in a safe world where the temple is safe anymore, if there ever was. There isn't very much of a temple left. You know, whatever you consider that temple to be. And the rules and laws, you know, they're kind of gone. And we are, and the kind of like the Constitution of America, you know, which was this kind of like Enlightenment rock on which everything was established. That is highly disputed and kind of hijacked in its way today, and there's all sorts of ways we can talk about that. So I want to think about the Markan world as our world, and what Jesus is doing in the Markan world and also the Roman world, because Mark is in Rome, I do believe, and he's writing from the Roman experience, and he's writing the Judean experience for the Roman world because it's highly relevant. How that translates to our own situation today in the year 2025. So let's begin quickly by reading chapter 1 of Mark. And it's not very much, but you know, after that introduction, we can begin to see what's happening. So we read Mark 21. That's after the calling the disciples, through to the end of the chapter. And then I want to read chapter 2 as well, but we're going to leave that for a bit and just read that, Mark 21 through to the end of the chapter. Hello, Andrew.
I can read it.
Oh yeah, Ray. I had to say hi to you. And
So
Melanie.
they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him."
Sorry, I'm saying chapter 1, Julie, sorry. Chapter 1. Julie just sent a message, sorry. Chapter 1. Carry on, please, Linda.
Okay.
Repeat the last verse, please.
But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also. For that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. A leper came to him, begging him, and kneeling, he said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I do choose, be made clean." Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. After sternly warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." But he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly, but stayed out in the country, and people came to him from every quarter.
Thank you, Linda. So just reading that as the opening kind of salvos of the gospel after the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist and the calling of the first disciples. This is and then the announcement, the summary announcement of the preaching of the kingdom. This is what Jesus does. So what's your impression of Jesus from those first verses of the first chapter going through to the end, in terms perhaps of the kind of things I've been talking about?
He seems to have had enormous authority.
Right. And how does Sheila, how is that authority expressed?
In his teaching.
His teaching, but so far we have no content to the teaching.
Yes.
Except the kingdom of God. I mean, we know he taught the kingdom of God, but in terms of something like Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, or Luke's sermon in the synagogue, that this day is fulfilled here, and when the deaf see, the deaf hear, and the blind see, that kind of thing. None of that biblical material, either from the prophets or his own teaching, is there in Mark. What do we have instead?
Curing of people.
Curing of people, that's right. But and the curing that is at least equally shared between physical healing and demonic release from demonic possession. So we have very much a healer here, and we use that language preferably, when people talk about Jesus as a healer. But just as important as his physical healing is his healing of the spirit of these people.
Mm.
So what's going on? What I mean, like, this is the first time you've heard this, you've read this guy, and you're a first century person. What does it feel like?
He's shaking things up, stirring things up, because his fame began to spread throughout the region of Galilee. I mean, you're up in the north country, but it's like this is something new, and lots of people in his being surrounded by people.
Right.
People are bringing people to him for healing and for to cast out demons.
Right. So there seems to be
from all over the place. There's a lot of movement.
Everybody's family has somebody who's demonic. Does that sound familiar? And I don't mean in a humorous way. but although it can be humorous, but you know, there's a disturbance among the people. That's, I mean, sickness, yes, sickness is something everybody wants to be healed from. But just as important as sickness is this disturbance or this fragmentation, this sacrificial crisis or mimetic crisis that's in everybody. And you've got to try and think what it feels like to be in that kind of mimetic crisis. Impacted by Rome and by the disintegration, the crumbling of the authority of the temple, and the attempt to replace it, particularly by the Pharisees, by these very kind of like strict rules, which means you're in or you're out. I mean, if you can't, the Pharisees considered the crowd to be cursed. I mean, if you've got this in group who behave in a highly strict fashion and proclaim by their dress their purity status, how does that make everybody else feel? It makes them feel pretty crappy. And if you're not educated and if you're not taught, you're going to internalize that in some fashion because you're still a member of the Jewish people. So I think that there's this very large, very, very serious identity crisis among the people. And it's a spiritual identity crisis. It's not a national, although it probably has, yes, it does have nationalist overtones, no doubt about it. But it begins in the spiritual because what we would call the spiritual, because they've been formed that way. And what it means most of all is that you're alienated from God. That's what it means. If you don't have that right connection, when you go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, it doesn't feel somehow right. You know, it's people believe the temple has been defiled or the temple priesthood is corrupt. It leads to a sense of destabilization, as I say, and disorientation. And I think that's really what the initial verses or descriptions of Mark's gospel are about. I mean, along with the physical healings, which kind of go along with spiritual healing, the two go together, as we'll see, that Jesus is countering the disorientation, the profound spiritual disorientation of the people of Judea at that time. And when Mark writes the gospel, he's doing the same thing for people in Rome. They will find through this gospel spiritual security, spiritual clarity, direction, consolation, strength. That's going to be very, very attractive in the mayhem of Rome, just as it seems to have been in Judea. Any comments on that? Hey, they're Claire.
Well, I just want to ask a question as to, and it's not only in this gospel, but Jesus keeps telling the people who've been cured from demons not to speak of it, as to the point. Now, it can't be just about crowd control, but I was just wondering why
do you think? Now, if you kind of imagine it, you've got this person who's got this profound disorder of their person, somehow or other, their personhood. It might express itself in epilepsy, as it seems to be with the case of the first one, but it was called an unclean spirit. I mean, it was seen as something that's destabilized in this individual. If Jesus comes into the presence of that person, and that person says, I know who you are. You're the Holy One of Israel. And Jesus commands that person to be silent. What do you think is going on there in terms of what the relationship that's coming out of the unclean spirit person? What's the relationship that they're offering to Jesus? that they're communicating to Jesus.
Well, the
Well, in
demons
that,
are,
Sorry?
go Mac.
What's that? Sorry, Claire?
go
No, I was
ahead,
just
Claire.
saying, I'm referring
I
to
was
Mac.
just, the demons are communicating a spirit of rivalry.
Right.
And as they come out, the person can be healed from their mimetic crisis, which is
Right. It would indicate to me, Claire, that that's exactly the case, that they're in an intense mimetic crisis. So everybody is a rival to them. Do you know anybody like that? Or do you experience that online at all? That intense rivalry that can crop up very quickly between people, and the slightest word provokes another word. You know, that is what a mimetic crisis is that everybody is in intense opposition. And what it seems to me is that the demons, by the fact that they say this stuff that seems to be true, but then Jesus hushes them up, that goes along with the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness by Satan, who says, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread, or throw yourself down from the height of the temple, and then the people will believe. It's what the demon is doing is trying to suck Jesus into its world of rivalry, of power over against the other, of mimetic rivalry, and ultimately violence. It sees Jesus as a threat to that, and he tries to suck Jesus into it, just as Satan did. I mean, the description of the actual temptations that we get in Matthew and Luke play out that relationship that the demons have of kind of like challenging Jesus. You know, we know who you are, and we're going to resist you in the way that we are. Have you come to destroy us? And if Jesus says yes, then he's right there in their world. Yeah, I come to destroy you. No, he says, be silent. He silences. He brings silence and non-rivalry, non-disturbance into that relationship.
Yeah.
how
So
do,
the
how,
go
So
ahead.
Jesus is shifting the framework and the grounds of how we're looking at things. So
That's absolutely the case.
we won't get sucked into playing on their rules.
Exactly. That is exactly the case. That's what everybody wants you to do. Play by their rules, and then they're going to win. The moment you decide to play by their rules, they're going to win somehow, you know. Or even if you know, like in a straight up fight, you beat somebody, you're still defeated by them, because you're part of that they can still curse you out, and so the rival still exists. But to deny rivalry as such is something completely different. So what is that? So we hear that Jesus goes off to pray after doing his first healings. He goes off to pray, and it's still dark. He goes to a deserted place. He goes to a space outside the conflictiveness of the culture, and finds that relationship with the Father. That is his power to bring this thing into the world. This other way of doing things that you're talking about. So there is, exactly as you say, it's an alternative way of dealing with human reality that is this completely transformative and revolutionary. As Linda's saying, he's stirring everything up, but he's doing it with this very different way.
I have two questions. How do the demons know how to call Jesus the Holy One of God? That's one question.
Mm.
Or is that a literary?
It could be that, but I mean, it could be a literary device on the part of the writer. But if there was messianic expectation, which certainly goes with the territory. If Rome is in charge, Rome is defiling you, defiling the temple, you totally need a Messiah. And to call someone the Holy One of God is basically calling them Messiah. You're the chosen one. So it's an insulting challenge to Jesus that, oh, you're the Messiah, and that immediately puts him in confrontation with Rome as well in their minds. So that giving that name to him is the same as Satan saying, if you fall down and adore me, I'll give you all these kingdoms. It's trying to suck Jesus into the political realm.
That's good. My second question is that book you made me read, the Lamb of the Free.
Lamb of the Free, yeah. I didn't make you read it. You're a free man.
He builds a great case based on this healing of the leper, that the Jewish purity laws were very important to Jesus.
I don't agree with that.
I don't either, but
yeah, it's a total, I mean, like basically says, using that precisely that story there, that he says, go and show yourself to the priest, that he kind of tries to integrate Jesus' practice with the existing purity laws.
Right.
Jesus is doing something very different. What does it mean to say that I go to the priest to go and show yourself to the priest? Go and show yourself to the priest. It means the priest can see, and he's like the expert, he's like the medical expert, that you don't have this thing anymore that counts you as unclean. So what Jesus is doing is restoring the integrity of the Jewish people, the Jewish society, using its construct as it stands, that the priests are the gatekeepers.
Right.
So he's forcing the gatekeepers to say, look, you can't exclude this person anymore.
He's also providing for the integration of the person back into the community.
Right.
And the kind of integration that was necessary at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
Not that Jesus agreed with me.
Because if you're forced out, you're not a human being anymore. I mean, it's another form of this disintegration I'm talking about. You know, it can either be internal, inside yourself, or it can be external. You can be forced out. Jesus is reconstituting society, human society, on this new basis.
Tony.
So go ahead, Claire.
So I mean, I was thinking that just was reminding me of, in a way, the current Pope Francis trying to say to the ecclesial church, you've got to find new ways of helping people deal with their spiritual development. You know, those old ways are gone and they're not working in the current environment. It was sort of saying a bit of that to me.
When was this statement by him? I know he said a lot of things, but are you thinking
I don't know exactly when. I mean, he's been sort of talked about as saying things like this. The church has got to find new ways, and hence.
Yes, it's exactly the same thing. I mean, like he knows, he understands the gospel. I think Francis does, and he understands that these forms of purity or whatever, of institutional inclusion and exclusion, are not the gospel. You know, because of just what we read. So he says you've got to step outside that and do the more Jesus thing. I mean, he's trying to. I mean, he's quite heroic in what he's trying to do. I think it's pretty difficult. Gail.
Well, I have a question along the same lines. If Jesus is healing people in order to bring them into a society that's sick, what's the gain? What's the
Well, that's a good question too. That is a very good question. What would you say would be a kind of holistic answer to that? I'm just imagining it. What, if that's the issue, that this society is actually sick? First of all, what is it sick from? You know, what is the ultimate disease that everybody's suffering from?
Violence. The violence. Yeah.
Yeah, that I would say is the ultimate disease. And then so in many ways, Gail, once Jesus begins on this pathway that we're reading here, he's going to end up on the cross. That's the inevitable trajectory. He's got to go there, and then, you know, that is not just a matter of your own personal healing and reintegration with yourself or with the community, all of which is great and good. But you've got to deal with the root problem that forms this, that creates that crisis and that disintegration. So yes, I think he ultimately, once he begins on that path, he's going to end up on the cross. Go ahead.
Well, my other question is, how does this relate to the very first part of chapter 1, in which he identifies certain people and tells them they're going to be fishers of men?
Right. Yeah.
Which to me suggests that they're about to help with a transformation.
Yeah. Yeah.
A different environment.
Yeah.
They're pulling people out of the chaos
Yeah.
else. And is this a way of showing them how to do that?
Yeah. Right. Very much so. Very much so. I mean, it's a holistic mission. I mean, first of all, he's going to do it himself, but he's going to gather a community of individuals who just happen to be fishermen, who are they're definitely got the job of continuing this thing. Both during his life, he sends them out 2 by 2. And then after he dies, they're extremely important in continuing this mission. But the amazing thing, Gail, is that I think it's only now, because of our condition in the 21st century, that we're beginning to understand this. I mean, I think probably people understood it kind of intuitively in the 1st century, and especially in Rome, you would get it spiritually, and it wouldn't be hard to get. But in terms of the kind of anthropological language that would make sense of it all, we've kind of had to wait until the 20th and 21st century, you know, and the horrendous breakdown of society and culture we see, for example, in the 2 world wars, and it's always been threatened. I mean, it's not a good way to be human, and it's not a good time to be human. But we've got this message, we've got this this gospel, this actually written gospel that shows this other path, and it is integrated, it's holistic. I mean, it goes from the beginning to the end, like you're suggesting, both in terms of the cross and in terms of his disciples. All those layers are it's not just one exceptional individual like a guru or almost a Buddha, but there's a program here right from the very beginning to incorporate the whole of society in some ways in this new way. That's the kingdom of God. It is collective, and it is sociological. I mean, that's it's intended to be. So it's very, and so as Claire is saying, you got the Pope, the top man in this big organization. He says we kind of need to be more like this, you know, in order to save our world. So we look at these. I mean, it's just amazing, really. So beautiful the way it's structured. So the first thing we get is this deeply disturbed, mimetically rivalrous and unclean person. That is, they're separated from their real self, and they're in conflict with their real self and in conflict with others as a result. Jesus brings peace to that person. So there is the healing of that fragmentation, that fragment spirit. That's the first thing we see. Then what comes after that? What's the next episode directly after that?
The fever.
All right, okay. So it goes into the house of Simon and Andrew, and Simon's mother-in-law is sick with a fever. So she has a cold or a flu or something. She has something very simple. She's not demonized. She's not fragmented, but she's sick. And so Jesus goes from the public square, the public environment of the synagogue, into the private domestic environment of a family. He goes from one scene to the other. And in this private domestic environment, somebody is physically sick, which threatens the life in its overall character of that little unit. If she's sick, then the family is destabilized and threatened in some ways. So he immediately brings healing from the public. He brings healing in the public square, and then he gives healing in the domestic scene, which is not suffering directly or critically from the breakdown of the spiritual culture, the spiritual world. It's just threatened by something normal, like sickness, like a flu. But equally to bringing peace to the public environment, he brings healing to the private and domestic environment. And there's a direct segue between the two. Now, what does that suggest? What would that suggest? If he started off by confronting and silencing this spirit's fragment in somebody, and then he heals Simon's mother-in-law, what does that suggest? You know, like in the overall picture that we're kind of creating about Jesus' activity.
But it speaks to me, I'd have to say, of something like the day-to-day.
Yeah.
The your day-to-day activities is extremely important, as well as
they're both.
It's
that's very true. And like when we begin our sessions, our studies here, we always pray for the day-to-day. We pray for people who are suffering in any kind of way, as we do. And that's very natural for us to do, because it's on our hearts, you know, like someone who's sick, it will be on our hearts. But what I would underline is that the same amount of attention that we give to the day-to-day, the gospel gives to the spiritual fracturing of the world. They're both equal. Now we have many ways of, or you know, like Christian tradition has often emphasized the helping professions, like the health professions, and rightly so. But we've not been equivalently good at bringing reconciliation, peace, and transformation to the relational and spiritual world. We've not been the same as that. Everybody will applaud you for serving the sick, and that's exactly what the Simon's mother-in-law does. actually turns to service, which is what the private world, the domestic world always depends on. Somebody has to be there to help and serve the others. So it's reinforcing and propping up and affirming the domestic world. And we all, who's going to do the laundry, who's going to make the dinner. Those are always questions, but they're all part of bringing kingdom life to the world. But equivalently important is what Mark is stressing, is bringing peace to a world ridden with violence. The two things are equal, and that's a big consideration. So what then comes after that? Okay, the next thing, and we've already talked a little bit about it. Well, the first thing is that Jesus goes off to pray to kind of recharge his batteries, and then he says, "I've got to go throughout Galilee. I've got to teach elsewhere," and he goes throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. So it's just like this campaign of restoring the peace and integrity in God of the people. That's what he's doing. But then after that, we get another healing. And what is this? We've already talked about it. What is this? What is the healing that comes next?
The leper.
The leper.
Mm-hmm.
So just to recap, what is a leper?
Someone with leprosy, a skin disorder.
It's a skin disorder. That's right. I mean, they
And
tell us
also an outcast.
an outcast. Why is somebody with a skin disorder a visible?
It's contagious. It's contagious.
It's contagious, and also it's upsetting. It's disturbing. Somebody with a serious infection on their face, it becomes another mimetic challenge, because we identify with naturally we are one with the other, but we don't want to be we don't want to be the same as this other person. It's what Gerard calls undifferentiation. If something breaks down our sense of difference, you are this, you look normally, you're one of our culture, and you have your role, you belong to this family, whatever. But if you don't look the same in some, you are the same, but you don't look the same, that breaks down the structure of our world. So we want to push those people out, and
No, I think because we're mimetic, we have those mirror neurons.
that's
So
right.
when we are always looking at people's faces, and when someone's face is not able to respond that way, it's disturbing. We don't know how to deal with that, and
and we want to get rid of it.
Yeah, people are very.
These people could not go to the temple. According to the legislation, they were considered unclean. I mean, the way Gerard defines it is that they are a threat, because they break down difference. They break down the order of difference. I mean, that's his analytic thought about it. But whatever, we know that the legislation was that you could not re-enter the community until you were clean again. So a leper, I mean, along with the demon-possessed person, these people have, in the Gospels, they have a kind of paradigmatic quality. They're kind of models of those who are outside the world of human love, really, of relationship. They're either so disturbed that they're always in rivalry with others, or that they're cast out because they have this apparent this look about them which disturbs people and which breaks down the order and the sense of purity of a given society. So Jesus immediately heals this person, or as we read it here, it's very interesting. The leper came to him, begging him, and kneeling before him, he said to him, if you choose, you can make me clean. Now, in the manuscripts, there's two variants. One is, moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I do choose, be clean. Or, moved with anger. That's in the manuscript tradition. And the kind of scholarly criterion for the more authentic version is the more difficult reading. The more difficult reading is obviously Jesus is angry. Why would he be angry? He's angry, I would say, because this person is excluded from the community. And this apparent disabling feature of this person has excluded him. So Jesus is disturbed within himself, as we see elsewhere in the Gospels, by this other form of human culture, which creates these boundaries, these barriers. And that's why he chooses, as the Gospel is saying, I do choose to heal you. He's making a choice to overcome that way of structuring and constructing culture and society, saying, be healed. Now go and show yourself to the priest, because the priest, as the gatekeeper, is then also forced by the nature of the rules to bring you back into the community. So we've had the disturbance in a public place brought by mimetic rivalry. We've had the disturbance within the domestic family scene by sickness. And now we really have the temple control of who's in and who's out. I mean, you could say the demon-possessed person, it's the violent world or disorder or uncleanness of the presence of the Romans, which had driven this person into this state. And now with the leper, you have the ideal of temple purity, saying this person must stay outside of the boundaries of the community. If we remember the movie Ben-Hur, do you remember that movie at all, about how the family contracted leprosy and they were excluded? And it was very good at showing that the darkness, the shadowiness, the kind of like subhuman life. That's what Jesus is angry about. If you take that reading, I think the compassion reading is the same thing, really, but it's Jesus' reaction. Jesus is mobilized against this. Jesus is an agent against this way of creating culture on the basis of excluding individuals who seem to be a threat or a danger. So you're getting a picture of what this person is doing. Go ahead.
¿Para quién es el hot water bottle? No, you could have that.
Who needs a hot water?
We got to mute Ruben there. He's talking about hot water bottles. That's okay.
He's in a domestic situation there. He's doing the mother-in-law of Peter thing there. He's making sure that people have hot water bottle. And in California, why do you need a hot water bottle? I don't know. But anyway.
I've been really struck with your insight on with the unclean spirit, silencing the unclean spirit as a way to like sidestep any sort of rivalry or fight. Like, oh, you've come to destroy us. It's a sort of subservient sort of thing, but it's also a way to pick a fight. Like, I know you're here to pick a fight. Yeah. And it's helping me with this passage here. Like, perhaps when he's approached by someone who's prostrate and says, if you are willing. He's sort of insisting on this subservient role. And perhaps, I don't know if some of the anger, I mean, yeah, I'm sure Jesus doesn't take offense at people, but if I'm willing, like, I mean, by this point, he's got a bit of a reputation. Like, he doesn't seem to be holding back. So, like,
No.
what it's like almost like there's a certain, I don't know, a false sense of an insistence on hierarchy, perhaps, that
Yeah.
Jesus didn't want to have with the people
Okay.
around him.
Okay. So you're
Go ahead.
you're saying that the leper is being a bit like the demon-possessed person in his language.
Perhaps and maybe he doesn't know any better, and perhaps this is really traumatizing to him to have this disease, and so it is. But yeah, perhaps Jesus would have been maybe even a little bit more comfortable with somebody a bit more presumptuous. Like, who was it, Mary or Martha? It was like, if you had just been here a few days ago, like, we wouldn't be in this fix, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think maybe that would have been almost a more comfortable, like, way to approach it. And the other point that as far as sidestepping rivalry, maybe the request for silence may have been in that situation, the priests would have had the longest toes, the easiest to get stepped on, right? And if everybody is like hearing that, oh, he's been clean, and he's the last one to hear, he's going to take offense. And Jesus doesn't, like, people are going to be plotting his death in a few short chapters. So, like, maybe he was trying to obviate, sidestep the potential rivalry with
no doubt about it.
with that request as well.
Right. I mean, if you're bringing, I mean, thank you so much, Andrew. I mean, if you're bringing a solution into a world riven with rivalry and trauma as a result, then people who get their livelihood out of that world are not going to like what you're doing. Either Pharisees or temple priests, or ultimately the Romans. So Jesus is a marked man right from the very beginning. And so the more he can tamp things down to give him time before he goes to Jerusalem, the more he's going to do that. He has to play for time. So go ahead, Sheila.
Would there be any relationship to what he said at the marriage feast of Cana to his mother? My time has not yet come.
Right, yeah. I mean, like, his time is necessarily going to be foreshortened. It's going to be curtailed because of the immense threat that he represents. So he has to control his time. He has to choose his time. Exactly right. And so his mother is saying, I want you to, he says, hang on, if I do this, people are going to start talking about it and I'm going to be thrust out. Gail, yes.
And there's a note in my Bible that suggests that it was thought at the time that only God could cure leprosy.
Oh, really?
So this would be along with what Andrew was saying about forcing Jesus's hand.
Right.
It's revealing his power.
Yeah.
In a way, in a context in which he's not ready.
That's right. And so when he wasn't ready, he was trying to hold back, but now it is public. He's trying to apply the brakes to slow the thing down. But then what comes next, the next episode, which moves us from the fractured public scene to the domestic scene to the temple scene, we then get to a place where the stakes become exactly what you're saying, where the issue of God becomes the issue. It's not the Romans, it's not the temple, it's not normal human culture. It's who God is and where God is and what God's doing. And that is extremely dangerous. And that's the next passage that we read. And it needs to be read in combination with what we've just heard. So we're looking at chapter 2, verses 1 through to 12. Someone read that. This is the last passage we're looking at. Chapter 2, 1 through 12. If someone has got that.
I can read it.
Thank you very much.
When he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around that there was no longer room for them, not even in front of the door, and he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some of the scribes were sitting there, questioning in their hearts, "Why does this fellow speak in this way? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" At once Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were discussing these questions among themselves, and he said to them, "Why do you raise such questions in your hearts? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up and take your mat and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home." And he stood up and immediately took the mat and went out before all of them, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this."
That's great. So this is an amazing episode and confrontation, because Jesus really does go too far here. if you see it that way, you know, because okay, healing the demoniac, they're all full of praise for that. Healing your mother-in-law, fantastic, you know. Healing a leper, certainly the leper and the leper's relatives would be so pleased. But here we have a man who's paralyzed, so he can't walk. There's something non-functional about his limbs. And they let him down through the roof. And the image obviously is intentionally recorded, because it's like an inbreaking. You can't get in through the front door, so you break the roof off. You take the roof off in order to get access to this thing that Jesus represents. So it is that disturbing, that overturning of things that Linda was talking about originally. But then Jesus does this amazing thing, which is says, "Your sins are forgiven you." And the implication is that this paralysis is connected to the sins of this man, or the sins of his community. So there's not a division, there's not a moral division between your kind of personal state, your personal moral state, and your physical state. But Jesus cuts to the chase directly and says, contra Deuteronomy, if you're reading it in Deuteronomic terms, that if you break the law, then these curses will come upon you. And that's where the logic comes from. This man must be cursed for something or other. There's something he or his parents did, because that's what Deuteronomy says, he breaks that directly and says your sins are forgiven you, period. There's no negotiation. There's no quid pro quo. There's no temple worship. There's not even the cross. There's Jesus's ministry of breaking through these structures that are of exclusion, of blame, of dislocation, fragmentation that creates trauma, or the trauma that creates fragmentation. He breaks through all this. So if you working your way back from this, you could say the man is paralyzed by the concept of sin as blame. That's he's locked into that. Whatever he did or didn't do, that's the way people see it. He's locked in to sin. The leper is locked in to uncleanness. The mother-in-law is locked in by sickness. And the demon possessed, the person possessed by an unclean spirit is locked in to rivalry. So you go from the social to the domestic to the temple to the nature of God himself. And you've done that really just in the arc of the first chapter and the beginning of the second chapter. And Jesus revolutionizes all those perspectives. So now God is no longer, I mean, the scribes are completely correct. Who could forgive sins except God? So this man is blaspheming. But he says, no, the Son of Man has authority, because Daniel chapter 7 says that all authority is given to the Son. All the authority and dominion is given to the Son of Man. And Jesus interpreted that directly in terms of relationship with God. He's got the power to put people back into direct, wholesome, reconciled relationship with God. And he does that. And people are amazed and they glorify God, saying, we had never seen anything like that. So just from that trajectory of those first 4 or 5 episodes, what does Jesus seem like? I mean, just looking at it in terms of how this is constructed, I mean, what this story is about. What does this man seem like? What is yours? You're an unprejudiced reader. You're not even a believer. Let's think you're not a believer.
So I just see him as being incredibly decisive and quite confident about what he's aiming to do, what he is doing, but obviously has such an extraordinary awe around him that people just flock to him and accept what he's doing and saying. But he certainly sets a fast pace, or at least Mark does. Yeah,
right. So just how would you summarize, Claire, if you would, what he's doing and saying? What is it? People are attracted by what he's doing. So what is he doing and saying?
Well, from our earlier discussion, it just seems as though he's actually, and very urgently, getting people to reconsider their relationships with each other and with their whole society, the basis upon which that's formed.
And even their relationship with God as a result, yeah.
And their relationship with God and with each other.
And that is, I mean, as you say, extremely decisive, but bold in the extreme. Audacious and bold in the extreme.
It really is. It is the overturning of the Deuteronomic mindset. All of these things. If you see misfortune as the result of sin, which they did. You know, they lost their land because of idolatry and all this stuff. So in all these different ways, these people were under the burden of this Deuteronomic mindset, and they were all outsiders as a result. You know, that if you have any kind of misfortune, it's because even the mother-in-law, you know, getting the fever is in some ways, you know, it's a misfortune. So therefore you must have done something.
Right.
You know, so and yet Jesus comes out with, you haven't done anything wrong. In fact, your sins are they don't know that idea, that concept of sin being at the root of all of this is overturned. You know, it's no longer true.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. We have four. We have Gail, then we have Sheila, then we have Mac, and then we have Ruben.
What I'm going to say sounds frivolous, but thinking about modern equivalent.
Yeah, right.
This is an action hero. He's really, it's Clark Kent revealing himself and, you know, picking up people and saving them from the flood or whatever in various ways. And I can see that would be very appealing to people hearing his story.
To people hearing the story.
Yeah.
So we're what you've done, you transferred the framework to presumably Rome.
Right.
And the Roman culture, the Roman Greek culture. This is, I mean, in the space of what is 30 verses or something, you've got to, as you said, as Claire says, it's incredibly very fast paced. I mean, this is a very modern writer if you think about it this way. You know? There's no frills here. He's cut to the chase, and you know, if this is a movie, you're right into it. You know, boom, you know, you're dropped into it. And so your comparison with Superman is not inappropriate, you know, in terms of the drama of this thing. Sheila, thank you, Gail.
I'm going to say something similar to Gail, but is this not an example of the basic teaching of Christ, love thy neighbor,
Right.
and how much Christianity is relational?
It's totally relational. I mean, what Jesus has done is invent relationship. I mean, obviously it existed before him. And it existed in terms of love relationship, romantic relationship, and family relationship, I would say. I mean, this is a way of thinking about it. But what he's done is he's made that boundless, unlimited. It's not restrictive in any sense. It's amazingly adventurous and new. And as Gail says, it would have been extremely attractive, and still is. It still is extremely attractive, because we're all under one of these burdens somehow or other. You know, like we've all inherited these burdens, and they manifest themselves in all sorts of ways, including sicknesses. So to implied here ultimately in the boldness and the audacity of the thing is the heavenly Jerusalem, is the new Jerusalem, like where all those issues are resolved. So Mac, thank you, Sheila.
I was just going to point out that violence takes a number of different forms, psychological, sociological, as disease. And we see Jesus neutralizing all these different kinds of violence, one after the other, in this quick and efficient manner.
Do you feel, thank you for that, Mac, do you feel comfortable in saying that he's neutralizing all these forms of violence? I mean, I know you are, I'd like you to say something about that, because in the past it would be like Jesus is overcoming evil. He's overcoming the devil. He's overcoming the curse of Eden, really, you know, like we've been driven out from Eden. So he's overcoming. We would have put it all in those different frames of language, but you use violence.
Well, take the leper, for example. There's the violence of the disease against the body. Then there's the violence of the community against the man because he has a disease. And then there's also the violence that he suffers in his own mind from his being uprooted from the community. And so, yes, I think that is a very good way to summarize what Jesus is doing, is combating all of these manifestations of violence, which are all interrelated.
Thank you. Thank you. It seems very appropriate to our world. It's almost as if the veils have come off, you know, the layers, the onion layers that we've covered this thing in. But when you boil it down to violence that way, it makes it very radical and very, very basic to humanity, what the issue is. So thank you for that, Ruben.
Yes, good evening.
Hi, Ruben. Nice to see you.
Good evening, good morning. When you asked the question about the arc of action and events, the episodes, in the first 30 verses, it reminded me of, I felt like the plot of a trailer of an action thriller.
Right.
And it almost seems like Jesus compared to like a guerrilla warfare warrior who's planting explosives that he's going to detonate in very specific, very surgically parts of the structure, whatever that structure is, that he's going to detonate and destroy. And then it's definitely the action hero genre. I see it, clearly, and I feel it.
You feel it.
But then I was thinking, well, who is this guy?
Yeah.
Well, his cousin, had a miraculous conception because Elizabeth was barren. And his own mother, it's almost like Superman, has some very mythological origins.
Well, that's Matthew and Luke. It's not in Mark.
Okay. So it's and I've never read the Bible that way. I've been taught it, behold the miracles of Jesus, the God, right? He's like to like these are done, he's doing this and it's showing his goodness, his superiority, his separateness from the normal human being. But if the way the discussion here is going, it's so much more than that. And especially, I'm going to hinge on to what oh my God, I forgot your name.
My name?
The surgeon. Violence.
Max.
It's on my screen. It's on my screen.
Definitely, I know, but I don't have my glasses on, but it's definitely that violence, the different levels or shades or gradations of violence, relationship wise, with the leper, the exclusion, the stigma, the ostracism, everything that's going on. Jesus is detonating and destroying any meaning that they hold on us. And he's for the reader, we not only have to acknowledge it, but have to be changed by it.
Right. So thank you. I just want to comment on the language you use there. He's a guerrilla warrior. He explodes or detonates these situations. And that's the only parallel. I welcome that, because because obviously he's not using violence. He's using something different. He's doing something different. He's not using violence. But the power of what he's doing and the depth of what he's is only paralleled in the use of violence, in the world of violence. We only see that the kind of stuff happening by violence. So violent revolutions try to do those things. But he's doing something that we only know about through violence. He's doing it by another means. So that is astonishing that he's found something.
Right, I was going to say that.
Go ahead, Linda.
Well, I was going to say that you know, you started off by putting it all in the context of the Roman occupation,
Right.
and you know, in Seven Stories, we've been in the section about the land and its loss. You know, all those people, those groups of people at that time were trying to respond to the loss of the land and try to sort of push away this idea of God's unfavorable action against them. All of the people in different ways, the Pharisees, the Essenes, the Sadducees, you know, the temple people, the Zealots, they're all responding in old ways of violence and they're all interpreting the loss of the land as God's disfavor to them. And even John the Baptist would say, well, you know, you have to at least turn around, you know, to repent. You know, God will be good if you repent, but there's still this threat of violence in God, in how people understood God in all of those ways. So it's kind of amazing that what does Jesus use as the sign of this new thing that he's bringing into the world? The sign that he uses is healing. It's healing, and as Max says, you know, all these different diseases are pretty not are understood, at least in terms of the day, as incurable, really, apart from the mother-in-law having a fever. But the others, you know, they're pretty you can't cure them. Only God can cure. So it struck me today for the first time that Jesus uses the tool, you know, the sign of healings to point us away from understanding God in terms of retributive violence because of our sinfulness, that equation that all of those groups agreed with. Really, they all accepted that it's the Deuteronomic worldview that I get back to again. You know, they all in their own ways haven't moved on from that, and we still have it pretty heavy in our world today. You know, that if something bad happens, it's because, you know, you must have done something wrong. So so he's trying to kind of it's both dramatic but non-violent sign. It's a dramatic and a non-violent sign to shift the way people were thinking about God and how all that's the way the world works, and how God fits into that, you know. And he just sort of pulls the rug out from under it by doing this one thing in all these different ways, you know, whether it's psychological, spiritual, physical, ill health. And these are all things that as Ruben and Matt were saying, they all stem from violence. You know, the disease is often results of violence, either, you know, like poor care, you know, poverty, all these things can factor in, you know. So disease is I mean, it's a masterful thing that he did. It was a masterful way to use to announce the kingdom of God, you know, in this way. It's pretty traumatic and and cool, very cool. I mean, I can't think of a sign that he could have done. And that's why he says to John the Baptist, tell John the Baptist what I'm doing. I'm healing people. Because John the Baptist, he couldn't get his brain around that, It's not how it ever has been. So I think it's great. It's great.
Well, thank you, and that leads to my last question. I mean, we're running out of time, but we can think about it. I mean, it's just
And
amazing.
also, just one last thing is that the next bit is Jesus and Levi. I mean, he's the
Right,
worst
yeah.
of all the sinners. So it's all part of the same
Oh,
stuff.
it is. I mean, like Mark's gospel is so striking because, as Claire says, it's so quick and it's so urgent. It happens so quickly, or as Ruben says, it's like a trailer where you get all the high points, whatever, and you say, I want to see that. I want to see more of that. I want to see that movie. It's a different way of understanding. It strikes me even as I'm doing now. This is like I've never heard this before. I mean, I have, of course. But it's like this is the first time. I mean, discussing it with others, it's like it's the first time. So the gospel is always remarkably fresh because it has the approach that you and others have described. It's not what we're used to, and its coherence and its flow, its dramatic narrative flow is so impressive. So it's like it's like hearing it for the first time, and I think it's what we need. I don't think the world can be turned back from its relentless pursuit of annihilation, except by this, and its power. It's the power of its message. I mean, what we've done in this session and the other sessions is try to unveil, try to strip away the layers so we see the power of the message. And I mean the actual writing of the gospel in 30 odd verses that you get to this. It's kind of breathtaking. Anyway, it is. So I mean, I can't ask you what you think about that. I just told you what I thought, but is one person, what do you think about it? What do you think about reading the gospel in this fresh way, or allowing the gospel? It's not us reading it, allowing the gospel to speak to us in its freshness. What do you think about that?
We like it a lot. That's why we're here.
That's not what I was wanting to hear, Mac. What I was not, it's not an external, I like it, but what's going on? What's going on when the gospel speaks to us in its freshness? I know you like it. Thank you. I'm glad you do.
I mean, I
I
think
think
it's just like, go ahead, Sheila.
Sheila.
Go
I
ahead.
think I think it's a gift to us in times of terrible turbulence and uncertainty.
Right.
It's the same message, but we haven't been listening to it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just amazing. I think that's exactly right, Sheila, is that we can discover our deafness again and again and again. I mean, like we think, being a Christian in a sociological sense is not the same thing as hearing the gospel.
No.
I think each time you read the gospel over again, like just now, and for me, that hit me that Jesus was such a, that masterful use of that sign. That's a new insight for me. And I've read Mark a gazillion times probably, so each time for me, what happens is that the intelligence and the masterfulness of the creativity and of Jesus comes through. This individual comes through even stronger each time I read it. That he just comes more and more three-dimensional. He just kind of pops out of the text more and more each time you read it. I mean, you read it first and he's a character in a novel, but as you go forward, you just he just sort of blows you away more and more each time you read it. I think that's what happens for me anyway.
And it strikes me that this could not have been made up.
Dan is waving his hand.
Dan, sorry,
Dan, go ahead.
thank you, Claire. Thank you.
The temptation.
It takes someone in Australia to notice something going on in America, but here, go on, Dan.
Thank you. The temptation to see Jesus as a superhero sort of has provided me with the first maybe glimmer of understanding of why Jesus in chapter 8 of Mark begins to teach the disciples that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected by the elders, chief, killed, and rise on the third day. Tonight's introduction has maybe for the first time helped me understand what that might, the significance of that statement.
Yeah, that's true. So true. Yeah.
It helped you understand the statement in chapter 8 that the Son of Man must suffer and die and rise on the third day. How did it help you understand that?
It's breaking our normal sort of connection, the assumption that superheroes need power, violence, and immunity from all of the kind of weaknesses of human nature. This is really a kind of a real different understanding of God's way of working, and the humanity that he's trying to shape.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Yep.
That's good point.
It is amazing. It is the superhero. It is the way to be a superhero that has been taught us, that the gospel gives us. And you know, anyway, thank you everyone. We're over time. And Laura, because you sit there, I can see you taking it all in, but you don't say anything. I'm going to ask you to pray again. I'm going to ask you to do the prayer.